A bitter wind howled through the trees, shaking the brittle branches that stretched toward the heavens like skeletal arms. Snowflakes, fat and heavy, drifted lazily from a sky as gray as slate, coating the world in a blanket of white. The small, secluded cabin sat nestled in the wilderness, miles from the nearest neighbor. A place meant to be peaceful. A place meant to be the perfect escape. But this Christmas, it would become a nightmare. Evelyn Turner had always been drawn to solitude. The thought of escaping her chaotic life in the city and spending a peaceful holiday in the quiet woods had seemed like the perfect idea. The invitation from her cousin Laura, who owned the cabin, was meant to be a retreat. They would cook together, laugh, and rediscover what the Christmas spirit was truly about. After all, it had been years since they'd spent the holiday together. But as Evelyn arrived that evening, she felt a sudden unease creeping up her spine, like something was just off. The cabin was beautiful, rustic but charming. It had a warm, welcoming interior, with a roaring fire crackling in the hearth and the faint scent of pine in the air. But the isolation gnawed at Evelyn. The silence was unnerving. There was something about being so far removed from civilization that felt unnatural, almost suffocating. The walls seemed to press in on her, and the heavy curtains blocked out all but the faintest light from the outside world. The perfect Christmas retreat, or so it had seemed. "Laura?" Evelyn called out softly, stepping into the living room. There was no answer. She crossed the room to the small kitchen, but the silence felt deeper now, more pronounced. Where was Laura? A flicker of unease passed through her mind. Perhaps she was in the bedroom, napping after their long journey. Evelyn hadn't seen her cousin since they parted ways at the small town's gas station hours ago. As Evelyn went upstairs, her footfalls muffled on the old wooden steps, she began to hear something. A whisper. It was faint, like a murmur, just beyond her hearing. She stopped mid-step, straining to listen. The whisper was too quiet to make out, but it definitely wasn't just the wind outside. She shook her head, scolding herself. It was probably just the house settling, the creaks of the old timbers. But still, a lingering chill crept over her as she reached the top of the stairs. The door to the bedroom was ajar, and a single light from the nightstand cast a soft, golden hue into the dark hallway. Evelyn's heart quickened as she stepped toward it, half expecting to see her cousin lounging on the bed. But the sight that greeted her was far from normal. Laura was sitting upright, frozen in place, staring directly at the wall across from her. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking. She didn't move, didn't speak. "Laura?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response, not even a twitch. The silence grew oppressive, filling the room with an eerie stillness. The whispering began again, louder this time, and Evelyn's skin prickled with dread. It wasn't coming from her cousin. No, it was coming from inside the walls. She stepped back slowly, her mind racing. The atmosphere in the cabin felt thicker now, suffocating. Something was terribly wrong. She turned on her heel and bolted downstairs, her breath quickening. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. But the oppressive silence that had hung over the cabin was now replaced with an unsettling sense of anticipation. The air seemed charged, as if something or someone was watching. Her phone was dead, the battery drained completely. She couldn't even make a call for help. The storm outside had worsened, and the roads were now impassable, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. The thought of leaving the cabin sent a shiver down her spine. There was something out there, just beyond the edge of the snowstorm, waiting. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. An oppressive, waiting silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she took a tentative step toward the door. The wind howled outside, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the storm she needed to fear. It was the silence that had descended over the cabin, and something in the walls, something in the very air, was waiting for her to make the next move. Evelyn stood frozen at the door, her hand still clutching the cold brass knob as her breath quickened, her pulse racing. She turned her head toward the stairs, hoping against hope that Laura would suddenly snap out of her trance, but there was no sign of life from the bedroom. The cabin felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. It wasn't the storm outside that held her captive. It was the malevolent force lurking within these walls. The wind howled once more, but this time it carried a strange sound with it, something like a distant voice, almost lost in the gale. Evelyn strained her ears, trying to discern what it was, but it was as if the wind was trying to warn her. The whispering began again, more insistent this time, echoing through the cabin, each word curling around her like icy fingers. She couldn't understand what it was saying, but it was clear. Something was trying to communicate. "Get out." The whisper seemed to say, though the words were so faint they might have been a trick of the wind. Evelyn stepped away from the door and backed into the living room, her mind spinning. She had to leave. She had to get out of here. But something kept her rooted to the spot. The storm outside would not relent, and without any way to contact help, she was entirely alone. And then there was Laura. Her cousin, her family, was in that room, motionless, her eyes wide with an expression Evelyn had never seen before. She couldn't just leave her. The cabin seemed to groan, as if the very foundation were alive, and Evelyn's fear grew with each passing second. She glanced around, her gaze falling on the small, worn staircase that led to the basement. It was a place she hadn't explored yet, but her instincts told her that it was where she needed to go. There was something there, something that would explain the strange happenings, the whispers, the presence that filled the cabin. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn forced herself to move toward the basement door. Her feet felt heavy as she descended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The air grew colder as she descended, and the shadows in the basement seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The faintest sound of movement reached her ears, a soft rustling, as though something or someone was shifting in the darkness. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she pressed forward. There was no turning back now. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, her eyes adjusted to the dim light. The basement was cluttered, filled with old furniture, boxes of holiday decorations, and dusty heirlooms from long-forgotten generations. But it wasn't the items in the basement that caught her attention. It was the strange symbols scrawled on the stone walls. They were crude, as if someone had used a sharp object to carve them into the stone. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that some of the symbols seemed to repeat, forming a pattern. Her fingers trembled as she traced one of the marks. The instant her skin touched the cold stone, a jolt of energy surged through her body. It was as if the basement itself had come alive. She pulled her hand away, gasping for air, but the sensation lingered, an electric hum that filled the room. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the basement, partially obscured by shadows, was an old wooden chest. It looked ancient, its surface worn and scarred, but there was something about it that drew her in. The whispers returned, louder now, as if urging her to open it. Evelyn hesitated, but the pull was irresistible. She knew that chest held the key to everything. She had to know what was inside. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a collection of old journals, yellowed and brittle with age. They were tied together with a thick, red ribbon, as if they had been preserved for some dark purpose. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she flipped through the pages. The journals were filled with accounts, stories of strange rituals, forgotten rituals that had once been practiced in this very cabin. They spoke of summoning, of ancient entities that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to break free. But what terrified Evelyn the most was the last entry, written in a hand she did not recognize. It was a warning, scrawled in desperate, frenzied writing. "It is here. It waits. Do not stay. Leave before the dawn, or it will take you too." Evelyn slammed the journal shut, her heart racing. The whispers were now deafening, swirling around her like a storm of voices, urging her to stay, to join them. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her only thought was to get out, to escape before whatever presence lingered in the cabin took her too. But when she turned to flee, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room was plunged into darkness. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled for the basement door, her fingers frantic as they gripped the cold, unyielding handle. It wouldn't budge. The door was sealed shut, as if something or someone was holding it fast on the other side. She pulled and pushed with all her strength, but it was no use. The air in the basement grew thicker, heavier, and the whispers returned, now with a malicious edge. It felt as if the very walls of the cabin were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. She backed away from the door, her breath shallow and quick. The shadows seemed to move, creeping along the walls in the dim light, as if the basement itself was alive. There was no escape down here, not anymore. The only way out was to face whatever was waiting upstairs, but Evelyn had no idea what awaited her in that room. As she made her way back up the stairs, her legs felt like jelly, each step growing harder to take. The air was suffocating, thick with the sense that something was following her, just behind her, closing in. She needed to reach Laura to make sure her cousin was okay, but the thought of going back into that bedroom, of facing whatever had taken hold of Laura, was too much to bear. She didn't know if she was ready for that. The house groaned again, the sound coming from deep within the floorboards. Something moved in the shadows, something large and slow, like a presence that had been waiting to reveal itself. The temperature in the cabin dropped, and Evelyn could see her breath in the air. The room was colder now, impossibly so. She had never felt such a chill in her life. Then, as if on cue, the whispering stopped. The oppressive silence returned, but this time, it was different. The silence was a presence in itself, a weight that hung over the room like a dark cloud. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a man. At least, it looked like a man. He was tall, thin, and dressed in tattered clothes, frozen like a figure plucked from a winter storm. His face was obscured, a shadowy blur of features, but his eyes were wide open, unblinking. There was nothing human about them. They were hollow, dark pits of blackness, and they seemed to draw Evelyn in, pulling her toward him, as though they were trying to take her soul. Evelyn froze in place, her blood running cold as the figure took a step forward. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if he were caught between worlds. She wanted to scream, but her voice failed her. The presence of this thing, this creature, was too powerful, too overwhelming. Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out toward her with long, skeletal fingers. The air around it seemed to grow colder with each movement, and the temperature dropping to a near-frozen level. Evelyn's mind raced. She had to move. She had to do something. The figure was getting closer, and its cold, empty eyes never left her. She stumbled back, her legs shaking as she backed away from the figure. But the moment she moved, the air seemed to close in on her, like invisible hands grabbing hold of her. The whispers returned, louder now, overwhelming her with their frenzied, incoherent babble. The figure was almost upon her now, its breath cold and foul, its hands reaching for her, pulling her closer. "Laura!" Evelyn screamed, desperate to break free from the icy grip of the entity. But there was no answer. Laura was still upstairs, still trapped in her trance, her mind locked away by whatever dark force had taken hold of the cabin. Evelyn couldn't wait any longer. She had to make a choice. She had to face whatever was in front of her, or risk losing herself to the same fate that had claimed Laura. With one final burst of strength, Evelyn lunged toward the figure, shoving it back with all her might. The coldness of its presence stung her skin like 1,000 needles. But she didn't stop. She ran toward the door, flinging it open with trembling hands and bolting out into the snow. The world outside was dark, the storm now a howling beast that battered her from all sides. But the cabin behind her was silent, too silent. It was as if it had swallowed her scream, swallowed her terror, and now stood waiting, its walls hungry for more. Evelyn didn't stop running. She couldn't. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she sprinted through the white wilderness, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, just as she thought she might be free, she heard it. The whispering echoing from the depths of the forest. A voice low and dark calling her name. "Evelyn, come back." Her heart lurched. The thing had followed her. Evelyn's legs burned as she pushed herself further into the snow-covered forest, her breaths shallow and erratic. The storm had reached a fever pitch, snow swirling around her in blinding gusts of wind. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let that thing catch her. Her body ached, her mind was clouded with terror, but still she ran. The whispering, the haunting voice followed her every step. It was no longer just in the air, but in her head, curling around her thoughts like a deadly snake. "Evelyn, you cannot escape." The words were clear now, no longer muffled by the wind. They came from everywhere. Behind her, beside her, even beneath her feet. The voice was everywhere. She stumbled over a hidden branch and fell face first into the snow. Pain shot through her leg, but there was no time to recover. She pushed herself up, the cold seeping into her clothes, her skin going numb. Her vision blurred with tears, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She couldn't go back to the cabin, not with that thing waiting there. But then she heard something else. A cry. A faint, desperate sound that cut through the wind. Laura. The name escaped her lips before she could stop herself. She had almost forgotten, consumed by her own terror, that her cousin was still back at the cabin, still trapped in whatever nightmare had taken hold of her. The reality of her situation hit her like a punch to the gut. She couldn't leave her. Not like this. Evelyn turned on her heel, her resolve hardening. The thing in the cabin, the entity, whatever it was, it would not take Laura. She couldn't let it. She would fight. She would find a way to save her cousin, even if it meant returning to that horrible place. Her thoughts were a mess of fear and determination as she made her way back toward the cabin, her feet numb with cold, her body screaming for rest. The storm had turned into a blizzard, the wind howling around her, nearly blinding her. But through the swirling snow, the faint outline of the cabin emerged, a shadow in the distance. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The cabin looked different now. It was no longer the warm, inviting place it had been when she first arrived. It stood like a silent sentinel in the snow, dark and brooding, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. The door was open, swinging slightly in the wind as if inviting her in, or maybe daring her. Her steps slowed as she approached, every instinct screaming at her to turn around, to run as far and fast as possible. But the cries continued, faint but unmistakable. "Help, please, Evelyn." It was Laura's voice. It sounded distant, as though it came from deep inside the house, or perhaps from somewhere much worse. Evelyn stepped through the doorway, the cold air rushing in with her. The door slammed shut behind her, as though it had been waiting for her. The silence that greeted her was suffocating, the only sound the faint, echoing whispers in the distance. She couldn't tell if they were coming from the walls, the floor, or her own mind. All she knew was that the thing was here, somewhere in the house. "Laura?" Evelyn called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. She knew her cousin couldn't hear her, not in the state she was in, but she had to try. She had to. She moved cautiously through the cabin, every creak of the floorboards under her feet making her jump. The temperature had dropped even further inside, the air frigid and thick with something that wasn't just cold. It was wrong. The cabin felt like a tomb, its silence stifling, oppressive. She could feel the weight of something watching her. But when she looked around, she saw nothing. The staircase loomed in front of her, dark and foreboding. Evelyn climbed it slowly, her hands gripping the railing, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. When she reached the top, she hesitated. The bedroom door was ajar, but there was no sound, no movement. It was as if the cabin had gone completely still. Then she heard it again, a whisper, low, guttural, and echoing through the empty space. "She's mine." Evelyn spun around, her pulse racing. The voice had come from behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing. She could feel the presence of something sinister, but it remained just out of view, lurking in the shadows. She forced herself to step into the bedroom. It was colder here than anywhere else in the cabin, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. Laura sat in the same position as before, her body unmoving, her eyes wide and unblinking, but there was something else now, something dark in her gaze. It was as if her cousin was no longer there, no longer herself. "Laura," Evelyn whispered, stepping closer. "Laura, it's me. It's Evelyn. I'm here to help you." But Laura didn't respond. The darkness in her eyes deepened, and then, just as Evelyn reached out to touch her arm, her cousin's head jerked to the side. The movement was unnatural, violent, and then Laura spoke. "I told you to leave," she hissed. Her voice was no longer her own. It was deep, guttural, like something ancient and vengeful. Evelyn recoiled, her stomach twisting in horror. The air around her thickened, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding her from all sides. The thing that had taken her cousin's mind was no longer just in the walls. It was here, in the room with her, and it was hungry. "I won't let you take her," Evelyn cried. stepping back, her heart racing. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't stand by and let it win. Not now, not after everything. The room grew darker, the temperature dropping so rapidly that frost began to form on the walls. The whispers turned to shrieks, a cacophony of voices, all screaming, all demanding. And then, with a sudden, deafening silence, everything stopped. The cabin was still. Evelyn opened her eyes, not realizing she had closed them. The cold was gone. The whispers had ceased. She was alone. Laura was gone. Evelyn was left standing in the empty room, the darkness pressing in around her. There was no escape from the cabin, and the whispers, they would never stop. It was the week before Christmas, and the weather had been unforgiving. A relentless blizzard had covered the roads, isolating the Turner family from the rest of the world. They had driven hours into the mountains, seeking a quiet getaway to escape the commercialized chaos of the holidays. The cozy, isolated cabin they had rented promised peace and serenity, nestled deep in the snow-covered forest. The air was cold, but the cabin's fireplace crackled with warmth, casting long shadows on the walls. Catherine Turner, the mother, was busy setting up the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room. Her husband, John, was unpacking the car while their two children, Mia and Luke, played with their new toys. The peaceful setting was perfect, yet something felt off. The silence outside was unnervingly complete, as though the world had disappeared under the weight of the snow. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on the air. "Mom, look! There's a strange shadow in the woods," Mia called, her eyes wide as she pressed her face against the window. She had always been sensitive, and her imagination often ran wild, but the way she spoke now sent a shiver down Catherine's spine. "It's probably just a tree branch, sweetheart," Catherine reassured her, though her voice lacked conviction. She glanced toward the window, but saw nothing unusual, just the endless, white expanse of snow. As night fell and the wind howled outside, the Turners settled into their evening routine. The fire crackled, the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air, and the sound of Christmas carols played softly in the background. But despite the warmth inside, a chill seemed to linger in the cabin. Catherine tried to shake the feeling, but it gnawed at her. Something wasn't right. Around 10 p.m., after the children had gone to bed, Catherine and John sat in the living room sipping hot chocolate. The fire had burned low, and the shadows in the room stretched longer. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps crunched on the snow outside the cabin, sharp and deliberate. Both of them froze, staring at the front door. "Did you hear that?" John asked, his voice tight with concern. Catherine nodded, her heart racing. "Who could be out there? We're so far from town." John stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he walked to the window. He peered outside, his breath fogging up the glass. The snow was still falling heavily, obscuring the view, but he saw nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone or anything. "It's nothing," John muttered, but Catherine could see the unease in his eyes. Probably just an animal. But Catherine wasn't so sure. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too human. As she sat back down on the couch, she glanced toward the door, wondering who or what was out there in the storm. A cold, uncomfortable sensation settled in her chest, one that only deepened as the wind howled louder outside. Something wasn't right about this place, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't as alone as they thought. As the night dragged on, the eerie silence returned, and with it came a sense of dread. The children were still asleep, but Catherine couldn't help but glance at the clock every few minutes. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., and still the feeling of being watched never faded. Catherine struggled to keep her eyes open, but sleep eluded her. The fire in the hearth had long since died down to embers, and she heard a faint rustling sound coming from the kitchen. She told herself it was the wind or a mouse, but deep down, she knew better. Then, a soft knock came at the door. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. John was still on the couch, his eyes closed, seemingly unaware of the sound. Slowly she stood up, heart pounding. She tiptoed toward the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. The knock came again, louder this time, as if someone or something was impatiently waiting for her to open the door. "Who is it?" Catherine called, trying to keep her voice steady. There was no answer, only the sound of breathing, deep, ragged breaths that sent chills down her spine. For a moment, Catherine stood frozen, her hand still on the door. Then, without thinking, she threw open the door, only to find nothing but the darkness of the storm. The door swung wide, creaking in the wind, but the front porch was empty. Snowflakes danced in the harsh gusts, and the only sound was the howling wind. Catherine blinked in disbelief, her breath misting in front of her as she peered into the darkness. No footprints, no signs of anyone who could have knocked. The storm raged on, the world beyond the cabin swallowed by an impenetrable sea of white. Is someone out there? John's voice broke through the silence as he stepped up behind Catherine, his face pale and tense. What happened? Catherine shook her head, her pulse racing. There's no one, but I heard a knock. John stepped forward, glancing at the empty porch. It's just the wind, Cat. You're imagining things. But Catherine wasn't convinced. She knew what she had heard, a knock, soft but distinct, and the sound of breathing that followed. Her stomach churned as an unsettling thought crossed her mind. What if it hadn't been the wind? What if someone, or something, was out there in the storm, watching them? I don't think we're alone here, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. I feel it. Something's wrong. John gave her a reassuring smile, though it looked strained. You're tired. We both are. Let's go back inside. We're safe here. But even as he spoke, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. The trees surrounding the cabin seemed to lean in closer, their skeletal branches swaying as though they were alive, stretching toward the house. She felt her heart race in her chest as she stepped back inside, the cold air nipping at her skin. The door clicked shut behind them with an eerie finality. As the night wore on, Catherine's unease only grew. The children were still asleep, oblivious to the strange happenings that had already begun to unfold. But Catherine couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of what had happened outside. Had she really heard a knock? Or was her mind playing tricks on her, influenced by the isolation and the storm? She couldn't tell. Around 2 a.m., she heard the rustling again. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The sound seemed to come from the kitchen, a soft scraping noise as though something was moving across the floor. Catherine sat up in bed, her heart thudding in her chest. Her eyes flicked to John, still asleep beside her, unaware of the creeping terror that was building inside her. Catherine slowly crept out of bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. She moved toward the kitchen, the darkness thick around her. The scraping sound grew louder as she drew closer, a slow, deliberate sound that made her skin crawl. Then she saw it. In the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, she could make out a dark shape, a figure standing motionless in the middle of the kitchen. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its form blending into the shadows as if it were part of the darkness itself. Catherine froze, her breath caught in her throat, her mind racing for an explanation. Was it a person? Was it real? The figure didn't move. It just stood there facing the wall, as if waiting for something. The longer Catherine stared at it, the more it seemed to blend into the darkness, as if it was made of the very shadows themselves. Fear surged through her, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her body refusing to obey her mind. The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that she could see her breath puffing in front of her. The figure's outline began to shift, its edges becoming less defined, like smoke drifting in the night air. And then, without warning, it turned toward her. Catherine gasped, her heart nearly stopping in her chest. The figure's face was obscured, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold, empty, and malevolent. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. "Who are you?" Catherine whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a slow, deliberate step toward her, its movements unnatural, jerky, like something that wasn't quite human. Catherine took a step back, her legs shaking. She needed to wake John, needed to tell him what was happening, but her mouth went dry. The figure took another step forward. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. Catherine stood frozen in the kitchen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She scanned the room, half expecting the figure to reappear, but there was nothing. Only the darkness and the echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. She stumbled back toward the bedroom, her mind reeling, unsure of what she had just witnessed. She shook John awake, her voice frantic. "John, wake up! There's something in the house. Something, not human." John groggily rubbed his eyes, still half dazed. "Cat, calm down, you're just dreaming. There's nothing here." But Catherine could feel it, the presence, lurking just out of sight. The thing from the kitchen. She could still sense it, even though it was gone. Whatever it was not finished with them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The fireplace was lit once again, but the warmth it provided felt like a distant memory. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes darting nervously to the dark corners of the room, unable to shake the feeling that they were not alone. She had told John what she saw, what she felt, but he was too tired to fully understand. To him it was just a product of isolation, of too many long hours in the snowstorm, but to Catherine it felt all too real. "We need to leave," Catherine insisted, her voice tight with fear. "There's something here. Something watching us." John sighed, clearly irritated. "Cat, we're miles from anywhere. We're stuck here until the storm clears. We're safe, whatever you saw." "I saw it too," interrupted Mia from the doorway. Her small voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "Mom, I saw it too. The tall man, he was standing outside the window, in the snow." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, sweetie? What tall man?" Maya, usually a calm and imaginative child, was shaking, her face pale. "He was watching us. His face was all wrong. It was like it was covered in shadows." Catherine's stomach churned. She had hoped that Mia's imagination had gotten the best of her, but hearing her daughter repeat what she had seen just confirmed it. Whatever it was real. It was out there. John glanced at his wife, then at Mia, before sighing heavily. "This is just a nightmare. You've both been hearing things. It's the storm playing tricks on you." But as John spoke, Catherine noticed something, his voice faltering, the slight tremor in his hands as he held them out. He wasn't as confident as he was pretending to be. Something had shifted in him. He was scared too. A loud bang from the other side of the cabin interrupted the moment. All three of them froze, their eyes wide. The sound had come from upstairs, from the guest bedroom where their luggage was stored. There was no reason for it. Nothing should have been moving up there. John's expression hardened as he stood up slowly. "I'll go check it out," he said, his voice tight. "You two stay here." Catherine opened her mouth to protest, but she couldn't form the words. Instead, she grabbed Mia's hand and held it tightly, both of them staring toward the stairs with fearful eyes. John made his way toward the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he ascended the stairs. The moment he stepped out of view, Catherine grabbed Mia, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I don't want to be here, Mommy," Mia whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I'm scared." "I know, baby," Catherine murmured, stroking her daughter's hair. "I'm scared too." Minutes passed, and the silence stretched on, almost unbearable. The wind outside howled, battering the cabin like some unseen force. Then came a scream, John's scream. Catherine's blood ran cold. She didn't even think. She bolted from the room, grabbing Mia by the hand as she raced down the hallway. The stairs loomed ahead, and without hesitating she rushed up, her feet stumbling in the dark. The moment she reached the top, she froze. John was there, standing in the guest room. But he wasn't alone. A figure, just like the one she had seen in the kitchen, stood next to him, its tall, shadowy form blending into the darkness. It was exactly the same, tall, hunched, its face obscured by shadow. But this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving. The figure reached out a hand, its long, bony fingers brushing against John's face, as though it was examining him. John stood motionless, his eyes wide, his body frozen, like he couldn't move. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Catherine opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came either. She was paralyzed by fear, her body refusing to respond. The figure turned its head slowly, its empty eyes locking onto hers. It didn't move, but its gaze felt like it was pulling her in, drawing her closer. Then, in a whisper that sounded like 1,000 voices speaking at once, it said, "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed in Catherine's mind, sending a wave of terror crashing over her. The figure took a step toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. John remained motionless, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes vacant. "No, no," Catherine cried, her voice finally returning as she pulled Mia back down the hallway. "Get back! We have to go now." But as she turned to flee, she felt a cold breath on her neck. The figure had followed her. It was following them. Catherine spun around, her mind racing as she backed into the living room, Mia clinging to her side. The figure stopped in the doorway, its form now fully visible in the light of the flickering fire. Its face was no longer just shadow. It was covered in something else. Something slick, something wet, like the flesh of an animal or the remains of something long decayed. "Mommy, what is it?" Mia's voice trembled, her eyes wide with terror. Catherine swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we have to get out of here." But as she reached for the door, she realized with horror that it was no longer an option. The door was gone. The windows were gone. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in, as if the cabin was shrinking around them. Catherine stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with an unexplainable pressure, as though the very space around her had been warped, bending under the weight of something sinister. The door was gone, the windows sealed shut by an oppressive, unseen force. The walls seemed to close in, the cabin no longer a sanctuary but a trap, a suffocating cage that held her and her family within it. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it glided across the room. Its face, once hidden in shadow, was now fully visible, a grotesque, misshapen mask of skin and bone, slick with what looked like decay. Its eyes, black as the void, locked onto Catherine with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. Mia clung to her side, her tiny hands trembling, but Catherine had no words to comfort her. There was nothing she could say. The figure's gaze pierced her very soul, and she could feel her strength draining away, like a slow, relentless pull into the depths of something horrible. The figure spoke again, its voice a low, guttural rasp that sounded like a whisper from the grave. "You don't belong here. This place is not for you." Catherine's breath hitched in her throat. "What do you want from us?" she managed to croak, her voice barely audible over the deafening silence that had filled the room. She tried to pull Mia closer, but it felt as though the air itself had thickened, making every movement sluggish and difficult. The figure's lips curled into what could almost be mistaken for a smile, but there was nothing human in it, nothing but malice. "It's not what I want," it replied, its voice slithering through the room like poison. "It's what you wanted. You brought it here. You called it." Catherine's mind raced. She didn't understand. What did it mean? What had they called? But before she could ask, the world around them seemed to blur, as if the cabin itself was no longer solid, but a shifting mirage. The walls melted, the floors twisted, and for a brief moment, Catherine felt as if she were falling, plunging into an abyss of darkness and despair. When her feet finally hit the ground again, she was no longer in the cabin. She was standing in a vast, endless field of snow, the cold biting through her clothes as if it were alive, reaching into her bones. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, swirling with clouds that seemed to churn with a mind of their own. The landscape stretched on forever, empty and barren, as though the world itself had been erased. Mia stood beside her, clutching her hand tightly, her wide eyes reflecting the same confusion and terror that Catherine felt. "Where are we, Mommy?" she whispered. Before Catherine could answer, a distant, echoing voice called out from the emptiness. It was familiar, yet strange, John's voice, but it was distorted, warped by something dark and malevolent. "Catherine, Mia, help me, please." "John?" Catherine called, her voice shaking as she looked around frantically, searching for any sign of him. But there was nothing. The vast, empty field offered no answers, only the oppressive silence and the whispering wind that carried John's distorted pleas. "Mommy, I'm scared," Mia sobbed, her small body trembling with fear. Catherine tried to comfort her, but she felt powerless. Whatever this place was, it was not real, yet it felt so alive, so impossibly real. Her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, but all she knew was that she had to find John. She had to save him. She started walking, pulling Mia along with her. The snow crunched underfoot, but there was no warmth, no comfort in the sound. It was hollow, endless. The distant voice of John called out again, louder this time, as if he were just beyond the horizon. Catherine pushed forward, ignoring the burning cold that gnawed at her skin. She had no idea how long they had been walking, or if they had even made any progress. The snow stretched on forever, the landscape unchanged. But the voice, John's voice, grew more frantic with every passing moment. "Catherine, please, I'm right here. Help me, help us." Finally, Catherine stopped. The voice was close, too close, but as she looked around, she couldn't see anything. The snow, the gray sky, everything remained as it was. But then, she heard it. Soft footsteps crunching in the snow behind her. She spun around quickly, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing just a few feet away, was John. But he wasn't the man she had known. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his expression vacant, like a puppet without strings. His clothes were torn and stained, and his body swayed unnaturally, as if it were being manipulated by something else. His mouth moved, but his voice was no longer his own. "You shouldn't have come here," the thing that looked like John whispered, its voice a terrible mix of John's and something darker, more sinister. "This place belongs to us." Catherine stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The air around her grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet began to crack and shift. The snow swirled around them, forming shapes, dark, twisted figures that emerged from the depths of the storm. Faces, arms, limbs, all reaching for her, clawing at the air with desperate hunger. And then the voice of John spoke one last time, its words echoing through the vast emptiness. "It's too late." The figures closed in, the darkness swallowing them whole. It was Christmas Eve, and Emily had never been more grateful for the quiet. The snow had begun to fall in soft, thick flakes outside, and the faint sound of wind against the windows was the only thing breaking the silence. She sat alone in the dimly lit living room of the old house she had inherited from her grandmother. The family home, now just an empty relic of past holiday gatherings. The walls seemed to creak as if they held secrets within, and every corner of the house felt colder than it should be. Her parents had passed away years ago, and her siblings, scattered across the country, couldn't make it this year. Emily had decided to spend the night alone, hoping for some peace after the turbulent year. The house, though familiar, felt different, almost alien, as if it had taken on a life of its own since the last time she'd been there. The air had a heaviness to it, and the shadows in the corners seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The tree stood in the corner, its twinkling lights reflecting off the faded ornaments that had belonged to her mother. Emily had spent hours decorating it earlier, but the effort felt hollow now. There was no one to share this Christmas with, no laughter or conversation, just her and the distant sounds of the storm outside. The atmosphere in the room had a strange weight to it, and despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, she felt a deep chill in her bones. As she sat down on the couch with a cup of tea, she heard something. It wasn't the wind or the house settling. It was a noise coming from upstairs. Faint, almost imperceptible. But there. A soft creaking sound, like footsteps on the old wooden floorboards. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the longer she sat there, the more certain she became that someone was upstairs. Her thoughts began to race. Her first instinct was to dismiss it. It was just an old house after all. The floorboards had a tendency to make noises when the wind blew through the cracks. But the feeling of unease in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. She couldn't ignore it. She stood up, her legs shaky, and walked toward the stairs. The sound was louder now, more distinct. Definitely footsteps. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling despite herself. There was no answer, just the sound of her own breath, shallow and quick. The stairs creaked under her weight as she ascended slowly, her eyes darting nervously from one shadow to the next. The second floor was pitch dark, the only light coming from the soft glow of the Christmas tree far below. She reached the top of the stairs, and the sound stopped, leaving a heavy silence hanging in the air. She waited, but nothing happened. The house was still, almost too still. Emily swallowed hard and stepped forward, her pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. She could feel it deep in her chest. The air grew colder as she walked down the narrow hallway toward the room at the end. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see a faint light flickering inside, like a candle struggling to stay lit. Before she could push the door open, she heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The voice was so quiet she couldn't make out the words, but she was certain she wasn't alone. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispering grew louder, closer, as if someone was just on the other side of the door. She had to do something. She couldn't stand there, paralyzed by fear. Taking a deep breath, she gripped the knob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the small, dimly lit room that used to be her grandmother's study. The light she had seen was coming from a single candle on the desk, flickering wildly despite the stillness of the room. Everything was as it had been when her grandmother was alive. Old books stacked in dusty piles, the chair by the window, the faded curtains, and the large portrait of a long-dead relative hanging on the wall. But the room felt off, as if something wasn't quite right. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move. "Hello?" Emily called again, her voice now barely a whisper. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. No one answered. She stepped into the room, eyes scanning every corner. But there was nothing. No one. Just the candlelight and the heavy silence. She turned toward the desk, feeling drawn to it for reasons she couldn't explain. The books, the papers scattered across the surface. It was all so familiar. But then something caught her eye. A photograph, face down in the middle of the desk. She didn't remember seeing it before. Emily walked toward it slowly, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. It was a black and white photo of her grandmother, but there was something strange about it. Her grandmother's face looked pale, almost lifeless, and in the background, there were figures she didn't recognize, standing in the shadows. They were all blurred, indistinct, but the more Emily stared at them, the more she felt a sense of unease creeping up her spine. The figures seemed to be watching her. She dropped the photo back onto the desk and stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. What was going on here? Why had she never seen this photo before? And why did it feel like the house was alive, like it was holding on to secrets that Emily wasn't meant to uncover? Suddenly the whispering started again, but this time it wasn't just a soft murmur. The voices grew louder, more insistent, as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with her. The air around her grew colder, and she could see her breath fogging in the frigid room. "Who's there?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The whispering stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Emily held her breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the quiet stretched on, suffocating. It was then that she noticed it, a shadow, flickering at the edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. It moved, shifting with a fluidity that made her stomach churn. Her eyes darted to the door, but it was too late. The shadow was closing in on her. She could feel its presence, could almost sense its cold, suffocating grip around her. Panic surged through her chest. She needed to get out of the room, needed to get away from whatever was lurking in the dark. But when she turned to run, the door slammed shut in front of her with a deafening crash. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the door with her fists. "Please." The shadow was now inches from her, its shape becoming clearer, more distinct. It was a figure, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and an expression twisted in agony. His mouth moved, as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispering began again, filling her head with voices that she couldn't escape. Emily backed away from the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was trapped. There was no escape. The figure stepped forward, and as he did, the room seemed to grow darker, colder, as though the very walls were closing in around her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice now a hoarse whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, he reached out a hand, fingers long and skeletal, and with a single touch, the candle on the desk flickered out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The sudden darkness swallowed Emily whole, her mind spinning in terror as the oppressive silence thickened around her. Her eyes darted wildly, unable to make sense of the impenetrable blackness that surrounded her. She felt her way along the walls, fingertips brushing against cold, damp plaster. Her breath quickened, and her heart raced. Panic surged through her veins like ice. The figure, now nothing but a vague memory in her mind, had seemed so real. But how could he be real? This was just a house, just a normal, albeit old house. Then, from the depths of the darkness, came the sound of shuffling footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Emily's blood ran cold. She had no way of knowing how far away the figure was or how much time had passed since the candle had been extinguished, but she could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Please," she whispered into the void, her voice trembling. "Just leave me alone." The footsteps stopped. A breath caught in her throat. For a moment, there was only silence again. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering returned. This time the voices weren't soft and indistinct. They were clear, ringing in her ears like an unholy chorus. Each voice a different pitch, all speaking at once. She could feel the words clawing at her mind, scratching at her sanity. "You shouldn't have come back," one voice hissed. "You're one of us now." Another murmured, its tone icy, "Join us." Emily recoiled from the voices, her hands trembling as they fumbled for the door handle. But it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. She slammed her shoulder against it in desperation, but the wood was solid, unyielding. "Please," she cried again, louder this time. But there was no answer, only the sound of footsteps drawing closer. She spun around, eyes wild, but saw nothing. Nothing at all. The house had become a labyrinth, twisting and bending in ways she couldn't comprehend. The walls seemed to close in on her, narrowing the space until she was suffocating in the oppressive darkness. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a faint glow appeared in the distance. At first, it was small, like a tiny pinprick of light, but it grew steadily, illuminating the hallway in front of her. Emily didn't hesitate. She rushed toward it, her feet pounding against the floor, as if the very house were alive, trying to stop her. But she didn't care. She had to reach the light. As she neared the source of the glow, she realized it was coming from the end of the hall, from the old nursery. She didn't remember ever going into the nursery since she was a child. The door was cracked open, just like the study door had been, and the light inside flickered like the glow of a fire. The closer Emily got, the stronger the sense of dread became, gnawing at her insides. But she was too far gone to turn back now. She pushed the door open with a trembling hand, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was exactly as she remembered. Old toys scattered on the floor, a crib in the corner, and the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The rocking chair by the window creaked with the faintest movement, though no one was sitting in it. But what caught her attention the most was the large mirror hanging on the far wall. It was cracked in several places, the glass reflecting fragments of the room in strange, distorted ways. And there, standing before the mirror, was the figure again. He was staring at her, his hollow eyes dark and unblinking, his mouth twisted in a cruel smile. Emily's blood froze in her veins. "No," she whispered, stepping back in terror. "No, please, I'm not." But before she could finish, the reflection of the figure in the mirror began to shift. The man's face morphed, distorting into something grotesque. His skin stretched and pulled, revealing a dark, twisted version of himself. A monster with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. He opened his mouth wide, wider than should have been possible, and let out a sound, a low, guttural noise that was neither human nor animal. Suddenly, the door behind Emily slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her in the room. The light from the mirror flickered and dimmed, and the room grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply. The shadow of the figure seemed to stretch across the room, its hands reaching for her, its grin widening, teeth sharp and jagged. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice whispered again, this time right next to her ear. "Now, you're ours." Emily screamed, the sound echoing in the empty house. She stumbled backward, her legs giving way beneath her as the figure loomed closer, its hands now almost on her. But just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, the door behind her swung open once more. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her vision swimming with panic and disorientation. The door had opened on its own, the sound of creaking hinges cutting through the air like a promise of escape. She didn't hesitate. She bolted toward it, her legs barely supporting her as she stumbled out of the nursery, away from the monstrosity that had haunted her every move since she entered the house. She ran down the hallway, the floors creaking beneath her, each step echoing through the hollow corridors. Her breath was ragged, her throat raw from screaming, but there was no time to stop. The house was alive, its walls closing in, the shadows stretching longer with each passing second. The whispering voices that had taunted her grew louder, echoing off the walls, mocking her fear. "Where are you going?" one voice asked, its tone dripping with malice. "You can't escape," another hissed. Emily didn't dare look back. She kept her focus on the door at the end of the hallway, the front door. It was her only way out. But the closer she got, the more the house seemed to push against her. The temperature dropped again, her breath visible in front of her as she reached the door. When she reached for the doorknob, her hand froze. It was ice cold, more so than it should have been. She twisted it, but the door didn't budge. It felt as though something was holding it shut from the other side, preventing her from escaping. Panic rose in her chest, and she pulled harder, her palms slick with sweat as she yanked at the knob with all her strength. "Why don't you stay a while?" came a voice from behind her. A voice too familiar, too close. Emily spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. There, standing in the doorway of the study, was the figure once again, tall, gaunt, and haunting. His hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, his mouth curling into a twisted smile that sent a shiver through her spine. "No, not again," Emily whispered, backing away toward the door. But as she moved, the shadows in the room shifted. The figure's form stretched unnaturally, growing taller and more distorted, his limbs elongating as if they were reaching for her, wanting to grab hold of her, to pull her back into the suffocating darkness of the house. The whispering voices now surrounded her, overwhelming her, drowning her in their unholy chorus. "You belong to us now, Emily." Her name had never sounded so wrong, so alien. It was as though the house itself was calling her, claiming her. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the terrible truth. This was no ordinary house. It was alive, and it had been waiting for her to return. The floor beneath her feet suddenly gave way. Emily fell, the ground disappearing from under her as the room seemed to collapse in on itself. She tumbled, disoriented, until she hit the floor with a painful thud. The walls around her began to shift and close in, as though the house were alive, feeding off her fear. The air was thick with an unnatural coldness, the kind of chill that went beyond temperature. It was as though something had reached inside her, chilling her very soul. Then there was a whisper, a voice so close it seemed to be inside her mind. "You should never have come back, Emily. Now you will stay with us forever." The darkness enveloped her, suffocating, pulling her deeper into its grasp. Her screams were drowned out by the silence, the house swallowing them whole. The world around her spun faster and faster, and she felt herself being drawn into something far worse than she had ever imagined. A place where time stood still, where reality itself seemed to unravel. But as her vision blurred and her thoughts began to fade, a flicker of light appeared, just a brief spark, a single ray of hope. For a brief moment, Emily thought she saw the front door, glowing faintly in the distance. She reached out, her hand shaking, desperate, as if it were the last thing tethering her to the world she had known. With every ounce of strength, she pushed herself forward, fighting against the darkness, the whispers, the cold grip that threatened to consume her. She reached the door, her fingers brushing the handle, and with one final desperate pull, she wrenched it open. Light flooded in, blinding her for a moment, but it was real, warm and pure. The house groaned, the walls trembling as if resisting the intrusion of light, but Emily stepped through the doorway, her feet finally touching the solid ground outside. The storm raged on around her, the wind howling, but she didn't care. She was free. For a moment, Emily stood there, panting, eyes wide with disbelief. The house loomed behind her, dark and menacing, its windows empty and lifeless. She had escaped, but at what cost? As she turned to leave, she heard one last whisper, carried on the wind. A final warning. "You can never truly leave, Emily." The door slammed shut behind her, and the house fell silent.